Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast episode number 105, and this is a bit of a follow-on from the presentation that I put out in the last episode. That presentation was by Ivan McKee, who you might remember from Business for Scotland during the campaign. Since the end of the campaign, he's moved on from Business for Scotland and has now become an SNP activist. Apart from that, he's involved in something very interesting called the Match Blair Project, which in the interview I unfortunately called the Blair Match Project, but there you go. He'll also be going on a speaking tour soon, so we spoke about some of the things that he's going to be talking about and much more. We also had a little chat about the upcoming election and how fluid things are, and ran through some different ways that things might turn out. So, we'll just go straight to the interview and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. Hope you enjoy it. Hi Ivan, how's it going?
I'm doing well, Michael. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Busy as usual.
Good.
So, what have you been up to since the referendum? I believe you've got quite a few things going on.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I mean, obviously disappointed in the result, as so many were. And like many others, I took some time afterwards, had to think about things, and then decided to stay involved, joined the SNP, as many others did, joined one of the pro-independence parties, and got involved in my local SNP group and been campaigning for the candidate standing for election for Westminster.
And has this been quite a different experience for you? Because you did this sort of speaking tour before the referendum, speaking about the economics of the thing, but actually being involved in kind of nuts and bolts politics, is that a new thing for you, or have you done it at other times?
Well, I have been involved before. I was in the Labour Party way back and did some bits and pieces when I was a student, and for a period of time after that. That's back in the 80s and early 90s, but it's been a long time since I've been involved in the door knocking, if you like. But it's good to be back out doing that, and it certainly gives you a good perspective when you talk face to face to people on a one-to-one basis. Members of the public that haven't come to a meeting to listen to you, and you get their perspective on things. So it's been fun.
So you're not convinced that Labour's still the party of the people?
It's quite fascinating, actually. There's areas where if I'd knocked on the doors 20 years ago for the Labour Party, you would have got a poor response because there were, let's say, some of the more better off areas and would have been Tory voting then. Those are the areas now where you get the Labour vote. And in the areas where you used to get the Labour vote 20 years ago, they've kind of moved lock, stock and barrel over to the SNP. So it's been quite a dramatic turnaround in the demographic configuration, shall we say, of where the votes are.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's sort of in a way that Labour are becoming the acceptable face of the Tories in Scotland.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean they are the establishment. They're the safe establishment choice for people that are looking for where to put their vote. But the vote has significantly collapsed, and there's no doubt about that. I mean, the areas of Glasgow that I've been campaigning in, it's quite clear. I mean, the mood on the street is quite dramatically shifted, and I'm hearing it's very much the same across Glasgow, across West Central Scotland. And of course, the way things worked out is quite interesting because the SNP is getting the biggest swing in the areas where the biggest yes votes were, obviously, but those are also the areas where the biggest Labour majorities were. So the SNP is doing enough in the yes areas to overturn the big Labour majorities, and it's also doing enough on a smaller swing in the no voting areas to turn over what were smaller Labour majorities and often 3 or 4 way marginals. So fascinating. The numbers of this are fascinating, and the outcome could be quite dramatic.
Yeah, but just to go back to the surge that you mentioned, I mean, that was quite an extraordinary thing, and like you said, you became a part of it by joining the SNP. I mean, that was a really remarkable consequence of the referendum, and I don't think anyone really expected anything like it.
It's quite bizarre. I genuinely believe that nobody expected it. I think everybody was shocked right up to the hierarchy in the SNP and the Greens as well. There may be some students or academics of the theory of what makes people do things in certain circumstances that might have an explanation for it. And I suppose when you look back on it, you could say that it all makes perfect sense in hindsight. But I think the reality is that absolutely nobody saw it coming.
One of the rationales you could hear is that people wanted to do something so that energy that was created by the Yes campaign in the larger sense, with all the little groups and everything. People didn't want that energy just to dissipate. So joining a party was one way of remaining involved, even at a bureaucratic level to a certain extent. However, I mean, is this going to change the faces of these parties greatly, or do you think there's going to be a still kind of more central control, and then this will go out with activists, basically feeding off a script, or is it going to be a bit more chaotic like the Yes campaign was in some ways?
Well, I think there's been there's a different culture. The Yes campaign was something specific, and it was very broad and very overarching, and all kinds of people were involved in that wouldn't be involved in normal politics. But that's continued, obviously. I mean, there's people like yourselves doing stuff, and many other individuals and groups in the broadcast and the media space, and lots of other groups that are continuing to do stuff. I mean, I got involved with Rob McAlpine and the Common Weal. I'm a director of the Common Weal. Is one of the things I've been doing since the referendum, and that obviously is continuing, going from strength to strength. And plenty of other organisations like that, Women for India, are doing some amazing stuff as well, and many other groups. So that wider Yes movement is very much still there. And I would take issue with you in terms of talking about the centralised control. I think from an organisation point of view, clearly a political party's got some boxes it needs to tick, because it's got to have a coherent organisation, because it is a legal entity apart from anything else. But in terms of how the policy and the direction is set in the SNP, and I've no doubt certainly in the Greens and the Socialists and as well, it's very very democratic, which has been one of the quite remarkable things about how the party functions in terms of policy and in terms of selection of candidates and in terms of all those areas. It is very open, transparent, and, dare I say it, unpredictable as well.
And what do you think about the idea? I'm not saying I'm for it or against it, but an idea was mooted by a number of people that we missed the trick and everyone should have joined the Labour Party and exercised democratic control over that, and therefore turned it into a anti-nuke, actual left-wing party in favour of reform.
No, I think the Labour Party is controlled very much from what happens down south. I think the opportunity for changing anything within the Scottish branch of Labour would have been very, very limited. So I think that wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, that's the exact problem I saw with that idea myself, because there's not really the power to change the policy in any meaningful way, and it could always have been overruled. So,
absolutely, yeah. I mean, and especially the way the Labour Party structures work, it would have been quite an impossible task. I think that would have lasted very long. And I think the way it's worked out has been the right way to go about it. And as I say, I think we could end up with a remarkably low number of Labour MPs after May.
I think another one of the reasons why the Yes movement has continued and the surge has happened is that I tweeted it last night that one of the reasons the independence movement in general is not going to go away is that all the issues that existed before the campaign basically still exist now and will probably continue to get worse. Like, one of the facets of this is the austerity economics, which was a problem before and will continue to be a problem. But in the wider context, one of the criticisms of the unionists about this is it's just about short-term economics. But there's nothing short-term about it. This has been going on since the 1970s, this constant drift towards the kind of neoliberal economic framework. And even though the crisis has proved that maybe it's time to go another way, they seem to want to continue to dig that hole. So I believe you're going to be going on a tour speaking about this.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And one of the things I've decided to do is to, as you say, go around the country again, like I did last year for the referendum. This year, taking out the message on a number of themes on SNP economic policy, really in support of individual SNP candidates in seats up and down the country. So focusing on a message to a business audience, to give them some comfort on SNP economic policy, and also to the general public who are a non-business audience who are interested in, as many people are, in what this economic policy is all about. Focusing on, as you say, the theory behind austerity, why in theory it doesn't work, and also the practicalities, the evidence that shows that what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years since the crash George Osborne's economic policy, why it hasn't worked. So I've pulled some data together, got a coherent, interesting message. I think people will find it illuminating as to why we are where we are, and why, while we can criticise austerity because it's not good from a social policy point of view, there's also a very, very strong case to criticise austerity from an economic theory and practical point of view.
Can you give us one example?
Yeah, well, if you look at what's happened, the plans that were laid out by George Osborne, let's say back in 2010 when he started on this austerity programme, was all about we cut, and that gets rid of the deficit. Well, the data shows that they've cut as much, in fact, more than they'd planned to, but they've made not anything like the dent in the deficit that they'd planned to. And the reason for that is because when you start cutting government spending, you're also cutting the amount of income that the government's getting in, because your tax base is reducing. People don't have the money to pay the tax that you were expecting. And all that happens is that, your spending's down, but your income's down more than you'd expected. And from an economic point of view, the theory's sound. That's what happens. And when you look at the data, and that's very much the way it's played out, it's not sensible economics, apart from the fact that it's not sensible from a social policy point of view either.
There's also governments since Reagan and Thatcher have been giving subsidies. It's just they've changed who they've given subsidies to. In a previous kind of incarnation of government economic policy, lots of subsidies were given to nationalised industries to keep them going. Now subsidies are given to banks, and also corporations. If they're not given subsidies, they're given tax breaks. Yes, in both cases there is some form of subsidy, but the effects of both those are extremely different, don't you think?
Well, you've got to have a coherent policy on where you're going to direct, call it subsidy, call it government spending, call it investment. You've got to have a coherent policy on what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think that's the important message. There's a lot of things that deserve investment because they've got a good long-term strategy that makes sense for the economy, because you're putting infrastructure in place, or you're creating jobs, and you're getting into sectors you want to get into. For example, it all comes down to an industrial policy. As I say, it needs to be coherent, needs to be focused, needs to be targeted, and you need to understand where you're going with it. The devil is in the detail, but I think the first message is that investment of itself is necessary, and we need more investment than we've had up to now. You can contrast the subsidy, if you like, that went into the banks and compare that to what we've done to our manufacturing sector, and you can see that there's been quite a different attitude and a different approach, and that, to some extent, kind of encapsulates why we're perhaps in some of the mess that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was driving at. But to go out in the more specific. So, for example, if you give the subsidy to the manufacturing sector, you're locking in a lot of that money here. It's not like the whole 200 million is just money sort of written off, because then you're paying for jobs, and those people will put that money back into their local economies and so on. But if you give that 200 million to the banks, for example, a lot of that money just flies immediately out to Swiss banks or God knows where, or into globalised financial markets, and no one seems to know where it ends up most of the time.
Absolutely, it just disappears, and that's the issue. And you're right. It's not as if money isn't getting pumped in to specific sectors in the term of bailouts or whatever, but it's getting pumped into perhaps the wrong direction. That's part of the problem. So I'll cover all of that. Talk about why we are where we are in terms of the main parties all cozying up to each other because of the effects of what they call triangulation, which is a horrible word that describes why parties try and take over what they perceive as the centre ground. But the effect of it is that the Labour parties have seen has drifted more and more towards the Tory consensus on this, which it's difficult to get see any daylight between them. And you saw it back in January when Labour voted along with the Tories for a further 30 billion of cuts in spending within the economy, which can only be bad in the long term. So I cover that and talk about also back over the ground, went through in the referendum about why and how Scotland's economy contributes more than our fair share to the UK's economy, and we shouldn't in any way feel bad about wanting to be heard, making our case when it comes to determining UK